Medicine in the Civil War. The Civil War marked a turning point in medical innovation and technology as thousands were saved because of advancements in medicine during this time of war. However, the Civil War is still the bloodiest war fought on U.S. soil, and over 400,000 soldiers died from disease. Although there was a significant lack of medical knowledge, there were still many advancements such as new medicines, sanitation reforms, and research. Prior to the Civil War, death from amputation and infected limbs had an extremely high mortality rate, and in sanitation, lack of research and knowledge was widespread. Medicine played a very minimal role in treatment prior to the Civil War, and additionally, the role of women in the Revolutionary War was quite minimal and they were not involved in the medical dealings of the army. War and bloodshed was not as destructive and deadly as it was in the Civil War. The Revolutionary War had about 20,000 war-related deaths compared to the 620,000 deaths in the Civil War. Despite its improvements in medicine and medical technologies, much of it was highly ineffective as 620,000 people still died because of the scale of war and disease. Truthfully, the Civil War was disgusting, filthy, traumatizing, and heartbreaking. In the words of Confederate General Nathaniel Bedford Forrest, "War means fighting, and fighting means killing."
Killing there was. Over 620,000 soldiers died. Huge mass burial grounds were animated, and construction of cemeteries was normal even in towns unaffected by war. Lack of food, clothing, medicine, and sanitation was also a problem for many civilians and soldiers alike. Hunger, unsanitary conditions, and disease destroyed Union and Confederate soldiers. With diseases like typhoid, yellow fever, diarrhea, and dysentery claiming the majority of lives during the Civil War.
Medical treatment during the Civil War was largely ineffective. 2 people died from illness for every 1 that died in combat. One major cause of so many deaths was the inadequate training that doctors received. During this time, doctors only had 2 years of medical school and received no clinical practice before being sent to the battlefield. Also, many of the recruits for the war were in poor physical condition when they enlisted, making them more susceptible to
diseases from which our men have suffered most have been continued remittent and typhoid fevers, measles, diarrhea, dysentery, and the various forms of catarrh. Of all the scourges incident to armies in the field, I suppose that chronic diarrheas and dysenteries have always been the most prevalent and the most fatal.
Sergeant Charles S. Tripler, Medical Director of the Army of the Potomac.
The reason for the most deaths during the Civil War was illness from infection due to the poor sanitary conditions at the time. Disease was often spread quickly in military camps due to a crowded population density, meaning it could spread from person to person at a much faster rate. Water sources were also contaminated with bodily fluids and fecal matter, spreading disease to nearly everyone in the camp. Harvard PhD and Northwestern history professor Henry Binford says,
There was very little concern about whether operating rooms were clean or whether doctors wore gloves and not any concern about masks, because most doctors didn't yet believe in the germ theory of disease.
The worst of the diseases, dysentery and diarrhea, soon became the leading cause of death in the war.
However, thanks to the work of dedicated and hardworking women who served as nurses, thousands of individuals were saved from death. At the start of the Civil War, there were no military nurses, and the experience of women in nursing was limited to the home and family setting. However, when these women heard about the inadequate medical treatment and basic supplies in the military camps, they volunteered to care for the sick and wounded soldiers on the battlefields, even with their lack of education and experience. These women had to challenge the existing belief that women do not belong in hospitals, and most of the male doctors that also served in the army disapproved of their services.
Early on, many of the volunteer nurses lacked experience and were initially incompetent, but eventually most of the volunteers were able to become proficient in nursing skills, even though they were never able to stop the rampant death among soldiers. Many nurses used less professional methods of caretaking and relied on their own personal techniques from home, which occasionally led to disagreements between the professional doctors and the volunteer nurses. But the nurses were able to contribute to the combat against diseases, specifically against scurvy, in which they advocated for the uses of fruits and vegetables to treat and prevent the disease. Many soldiers saw the nurses as holistic healers because the nurses had tended to both the soldiers' physical and emotional needs. This was specifically true of the soldiers with fatal wounds who were expecting to die. These soldiers would be calmed and comforted by the nurses' care. The nurses were also responsible for keeping contact with the families of soldiers, and they often helped soldiers with letters home and death notifications. More than 3,000 women served as nurses during the Civil War, and these Civil War nurses laid the foundation for professional nursing in the United States, and their work created changes in the public opinion about women's role in healthcare work.
Among the nurses that served in the Civil War, one of the most influential nurses was Dorothea Dix. Dix was appointed as the Union's superintendent of female nurses and served throughout the war, in which she oversaw more than 3,000 nurses. Although she met resistance from Army doctors who did not want female nurses in their hospitals, Dix set many hiring guidelines and took over operational responsibilities that made her a prominent figure within the medical community. She was especially known in the South for her equal care of both Union and Confederate soldiers. One nurse under Dix, Georgiana Woolsey, said,
"The surgeon in charge of our camp looked after all their wounds, which were often in a most shocking state, particularly among the rebels. Every evening and morning they were dressed."
Another influential nurse was Clara Barton. She served on the front lines, distributing supplies, cleaning field hospitals, applying dressings, and serving food to wounded and ill soldiers. Because she was on the front lines, she served in close proximity to several large-scale and well-known battles, such as Cedar Mountain, Antietam, Fredericksburg, and the Second Bull Run. In 1864, Union General Benjamin Butler appointed her in charge of the hospitals on the front lines. She earned the nickname Angel of the Battlefield because of her successes in treating the wounded on the battlefield, and eventually earned widespread recognition from her lectures on her war experiences, and eventually founded the American Red Cross.
One important improvement was in surgical procedures. Surgeons oftentimes didn't even wash their hands, but later on in the war, surgeons were required to do so thanks to the efforts of William Hammond and Jonathan Letterman, who pioneered medical sanitation in military field hospitals. Charles Tripler explained some of these improvements in sanitation and medical care during the war.
"I think there is an abundant reason to be satisfied with the progress that has been made in this army in introducing something of a system of hygiene, in instructing its medical officers in their duties, in keeping them supplied with sufficient medicines, hospital stores, and instruments, in requiring reports at short intervals of the sanitary condition of the regiments, and in instituting regular and thorough sanitary inspections."
One instance of this improvement was the founding of the United States Sanitary Commission in 1861, which held sanitation fairs all around the Union, raising over $410 million adjusted for inflation, helping the sick and wounded soldiers of the Union Army.
New medicine also began to appear during the Civil War. Calomel and paregoric, used to treat diarrhea, helped reduce sickness rates slightly. Morphine helped ease the pain of amputees, and quinine was used to treat malaria during the war. Also, quarantine was used to prevent yellow fever from spreading by making new ships wait before they were allowed to dock.
With the war came new innovation that changed the response and treatment times for wounded or sick soldiers, one of which came from the revolutionary thinker Jonathan Letterman. He invented the first ambulance corps of the United States, and it helped wounded soldiers get quick treatment and survive. Jonathan Letterman writes of the ambulance corps,
Great credit is deservedly due to the officers and men for their praiseworthy conduct. I know of no battlefield from which wounded men have been so speedily and so carefully removed, and I have every reason to feel satisfied that their duties could not have been performed better or more fearlessly.
Another revolutionary development during the Civil War was anesthesia. The introduction of anesthesia was important as it saved many lives and made surgical procedures more successful and easier to execute. Professor Binford says,
Anesthesia not only prevented pain when patients needed surgery and other kinds of treatment, but that it made the survival rate a little bit higher. They weren't doing enough statistical analysis to really know about this with confidence. But it's very clear that anesthesia, when it was used, and it wasn't used in every case, when it was used, seemed to improve the health outcomes of the patients.
The lack of knowledge about the germ theory led to many deaths from infection and illness during the Civil War. However, the other important advancements that were made in medicine and sanitation during the Civil War, such as new medicines like quinine and the use of anesthesia, and the increased role of nurses, were revolutionary and continued to be used in the future. Although advancement during this time may have been ineffective, it set a precedent in the scientific and medical community and resulted in the creation of modern hospitals, research institutions, and medical procedures. The work done by people like Jonathan Letterman, William Hammond, Dorothy Dix, Clara Burton, and many others lives on and continues to serve the people of the United States.